the CDC's dog. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on the CDC's dog import ban. I am Dana Bray. I'm one of the co-chairs of the International Animal Law Committee in the International Law section of the American Bar Association. Thank you so much to the ABA International Law section, Angela and Lauren in particular, for hosting us today. We're thrilled to be here. In June, the CDC suspended the importation of dogs from 113 countries considered to be high risk for canine rabies. Today, we'll discuss the legal issues relating to the ban and how it relates to public health, animal health and welfare, and international rescue efforts. We'll also discuss the upcoming process by which the CDC is planning to enact a final rule and how the public can express their views during the upcoming rulemaking process. This topic is near and dear to my heart, as I'm sure it is to many of our attendees and also to our speakers. One of my dogs is a rescued street dog from Syria, which is one of the now banned countries. I hope you don't hear her bark today, but you may, just a warning. And also a couple of years ago, our International Animal Law Committee worked to bring 4 dogs rescued from the meat trade in China to new homes in the United States, and China is also one of the banned countries. We have 3 fantastic speakers today who are veterinary and legal experts. I'll introduce each of them before they speak. Their presentations will take us to about the top of the hour, and we'll leave at least the last 15 minutes for questions. We're really excited to hear and respond to your questions. So please use the Q&A feature in Zoom to submit those questions, and we'll answer them all at the end. If we don't get to your question, or if you'd like a copy of the slides, please email me at D for Dana, B for boy, ray@stanfordalumni.org. That's dbray@stanfordalumni.org. I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Professor of Law Emeritus Pete Fitzgerald, who I consider to be the world's leading legal expert on the CDC ban. I'm not alone in that. Pete has worked very hard to track and analyze the ban and to share legal information about the ban with the rescue community and others. Pete is a specialist in domestic and international commercial law with an additional interest in international animal law. He's qualified to practice in both the US and in the UK and has lectured on international animal law in both countries. He's co-authored several books and numerous articles, including International Issues in Animal Law, which is a wonderful book that I highly recommend. Pete serves on the board of Soy Dog and also on the board of Yankee Golden Retriever Rescue. Pete, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much and good morning. We're going to get this share going here, I hope. There we go. We're going to be talking this morning about the background to this temporary suspension and the somewhat complicated legal framework that surrounds the import of dogs into the United States. There's a multiplicity of federal agencies and regulations that apply, and we're going to talk about that. I'll also touch upon the general dog import process and a new CDC dog import permit process, which was created along with this suspension announcement. We'll discuss why the CDC took this action and where we go from here. As Dana mentioned, this was announced back in June as an emergency action under the discretionary authority the agency has to deal with infectious diseases and other threats. And it was modeled loosely on an earlier temporary suspension, which was directed at Egypt. 113 designated high-risk rabies endemic countries are subject to this suspension, this ban, and that's roughly 60% of the world's countries. Western Europe is not included, but many countries in Africa, South America, Caribbean, Middle East, Eastern Europe, and Asia are covered, and it became fully effective only 28 days after the announcement on July 14th. Before the suspension was announced, we looked at roughly 1 million dogs coming into the country every year, roughly 700,000 by air, and between 60 to 100,000 coming from these rabies endemic countries. The numbers are rough estimates because there is no central repository of that information, and it's extrapolated from customs and CDC information. Rabies has been eliminated. The dog rabies, the canine rabies virus variant, was eliminated from the United States back in 2007. And since then, the CDC, although they don't use these words, has effectively tried to apply a zero tolerance policy for dogs coming in that might have the infection. And that started when the countries were broken out into the low risk, no risk, and the high risk countries back in 2019. There are three major agencies that deal with the import process coming in. You have the CDC, the USDA, and the customs operation, all dealing with imports of dogs. The CDC operates under the Health and Human Services Department, of course, with the Public Health Service Act of 1944, and its focus is primarily on zoonotic disease and controlling disease imports. The USDA's Animal, Plant, and Health Inspection Service administers the Animal Welfare Act, and their focus is on the humane treatment for animals. And the AWA was amended back in 2008 to specifically focus on the resale of animals, particularly puppies, coming in as a commercial transaction. And they have interpreted that broadly to cover a variety of transactions, including adoptions by rescue agencies and other transfers of ownership from dogs coming in. And finally, we have the Customs and Border Protection Agency, which administers a variety of laws to keep terrorists and weapons and other trade controls in place around the United States. But their focus here is to act, if you will, as the gatekeepers at the border. So if there's a problem with compliance with the CDC rules or a problem with compliance with the APHIS rules, the CBP folks will stop the import of the dogs and currently return them to their place of origin. So they are the enforcement arm at the border for these controls. Before the suspension, what were the rules like? Well, if we look at the CDC rules before this import ban was in place, there actually was no import permit requirement. There was no pre-approval of dogs coming into the United States. Instead, the regulations required that the dogs must appear healthy upon arrival. So when the CBP and the other authorities are looking at the dogs, you don't want to see any signs of disease or other problems. And there was an additional requirement that said if you were coming from a rabies endemic country or had been in one in the previous 6 months, then you had to provide a rabies vaccination certificate. The certificate basically is a document that says, yes, the dog was vaccinated, and the vaccinated occurred within certain time periods, basically between the age of 3 months and no more than 12 months before the arrival, and with processing that effectively meant that no dogs could come in under the age of 4 months because there was a 30-day requirement between the last vaccination and arrival. You also had to identify the animal and track the paper, if you will, to the animal with its breed, sex, age, color, and markings. And this vaccination certificate would be prepared by a licensed veterinarian in the exporting country. If there was a problem, CBP would step in, refuse to admit the dogs into the country, and the dogs would be returned to their point of origin, the flight that they came in from, at the importer's expense. Or if the importer abandoned the animal, then that became a problem for the airlines. And it was the airlines that had to pay for the return of the animal. We also had the APHIS process under the Import of Live Dogs regulation, which followed the amendment to the Animal Welfare Act. In this case, a permit was in fact required for dogs that fit that resale category. And that's loosely considered to be the commercial category. Private import transactions were not affected, but adoptions, transfers of ownership for more than a de minimis consideration were all covered and required a permit no matter where you were coming from. This is not a permit that's tied to rabies endemic countries. It's anywhere based upon the purpose of the import. And that picked up roughly about 6% of all dog imports. So not a whole lot. Most of the imports were outside the scope of this requirement as private import transactions, but it did pick up virtually all dog rescue operations because of the control on importing dogs for adoption. What were the requirements? Well, the advance permit requirement said the dog had to be 6 months old, and it had to come in with a health and rabies certificate, roughly equivalent to what the CDC had required for its rabies certificates, showing vaccinations occurred within 12 months of entry for a variety of diseases, not just rabies, but also distemper, hepatitis, leptospirosis, I can never pronounce this, leptospirosis. Catherine will correct me later on, parvo, and parainfluenza. And again, it had to be signed by a licensed veterinarian in the exporting country, and you had that overriding requirement that the dog had to be healthy upon entry. And the dogs would be denied entry if anything fell short. Now, we're focused here today on the rabies controls because that was the subject of the suspension. However, APHIS also has other requirements for dogs coming from countries with African swine fever, screwworm, foot and mouth disease, and other things that are controlled. But we're going to focus primarily on the rabies situation. With the new controls, with this new announcement, the old regulations have not changed. There's been no change to the CDC regulations at 42 CFR 7151. There's been no change to the APHIS import regulations at 9 CFR 2.150 and following. Instead, we have an announcement in the Federal Register and a variety of additional information being posted on the website where the CDC now says that you cannot import a dog from a rabies high-risk country, a rabies endemic country, without a permit, without their new special CDC dog import permit. They're also said that there are only going to be very few of these permits. They're going to be limited categories of applicants, which we'll talk about in a minute. You can only apply once during the course of the suspension. And if you're bringing in a dog under this permit, you can only bring in a maximum of 3 fully vaccinated pets. Additionally, as announced, they could only arrive at designated ports of entry. And in the announcement, JFK Airport was the only approved port of entry. And again, you still had the overriding requirement that the dog had to be healthy when it arrived. Looking at this permit in a little more detail, it had additional requirements over and above what we had seen in the earlier CDC regulation. First off, now, excuse me, the dogs have to be microchipped, and the microchip number has to track with the paperwork, so that rather than just using a descriptor, now there have to be actually some technology that's tracking the dog and matching the paperwork. The dog had to be at least 6 months old. And in order to verify that, photos of the animal's teeth has to be submitted to the CDC to verify the age of the animal. Then you had to have the rabies vaccination certificate with the microchip signed by the veterinarian, and it had to be in English or with a certified translation. And the new, really new requirement is that there is a antibody test, a blood test that has to be administered after vaccination, at least 30 days after the initial vaccination, 45 days before entry, and results have to be analyzed by approved laboratories, CDC approved laboratories, showing a particular level of antibody of 0.5 international units per milliliter in the animal's blood. This does a couple of things. It shows that there really was a vaccination that occurred, and in fact, that the vaccination generated sufficient antibodies to protect the animal. And coming from an approved laboratory, suddenly the CDC now has a back channel to bolster the confidence they have in the results and the documents rather than seeing issues that they might have had with fraudulent or inadequate documents prepared by unknown parties. Lastly, the CDC requires 6 weeks lead time to process these import permits. When you put all that together, you wind up with a rather complicated system. If we look at the top of this chart, I used the United Kingdom as an example of a rabies-free exporting country. And in the lower two sections, I've used China as an example of a high-risk rabies country. If you look at the rabies-free countries, you see that there's a requirement for the APHIS regs, the permit, that says 6 months permit, health certificate, etc. But under the old CDC reg, basically they just had to be healthy upon arrival, coming from a rabies-free country. Contrasted with the old regs for a high-risk country like China, you have a requirement that they had to be 4 months old, they had to have a vaccination certificate, and of course be healthy under the CDC regs. And under the APHIS regs, if you're looking at resale or a rescue, then it was the same as before. You had to have the permit, 6 months old and the like. With these new rules, now, if you're bringing a pet in from China, it has to be 6 months old. You have to get the new CDC import permit, assuming you're eligible. You have to have a rabies vaccination certificate from the exporting country, and you have to have a rabies titer test. Now, all of these requirements are triggered assuming that you do not have a US vaccination or US rabies vaccination certificate. In that case, you're outside the scope of the CDC rules, the suspension entirely, and you default back to the APHIS rules, which are on the line right above it on the chart. The last line at the very bottom says, well, APHIS deals with resale and rescue dogs. What about the new rules for resale and rescue dogs? Those are under the CDC suspension if you're coming from a high-risk country, and they will not license, they will not give you a permit for a resale or a rescue transaction. So it's a complicated mix, and it's a confusing mix. And one of the issues that all importers have is, wouldn't it be nice if we could get the US government to come out with a harmonized system and one public face rather than this complex mix that we have? We mentioned that the import permits have limited eligibility. As initially announced, it's basically a permit only for government personnel, US citizens or residents coming back to the United States on official orders or for education or for employment. So a very limited category of groups, category of folks. Service dog owners, imports for law enforcement, they are also permitted. Language that the CDC has used on the website specifically says that imports for adoption, resale, or transfer of ownership are not possible. Those will not get permits. Going back to the pet category, if you're government personnel coming back, what if the government personnel adopts a rescue in China or somewhere else? Well, there's other language on the website that says foreign rescues or adopted dogs are not considered privately owned pets unless the individual has owned that animal for more than 6 months. Short-term travelers are also excluded, and imports for a variety of other dog-related activities, dog shows, obedience trials, sporting events, etc., are not going to get a permit either. There is a permit available for exhibition, which is defined in the regulations, but that is narrowly tied to animal shows and zoological exhibits. And so it's a much narrower view of the word exhibition than one would ordinarily assume. When they rolled this process out, there were a lot of questions. There was a lot of confusion as to what was going to apply. And there was also a whole host of issues related to the practicalities of the new permit process. First off, There was only one port of entry, JFK International Airport. The Fly America Act, the Open Skies Agreement that limits the number of carriers that US government personnel can use coming back in, didn't necessarily have flights into JFK that matched what the needs of these individuals coming back to the States. So that was a big issue. Another big issue was you had to have the CDC approved laboratory give the blood test. And there are only 5 in the initial announcement: China, France, Mexico, South Korea, and the UK. None in the US. China, of course, was the only high-risk country on the list that had a lab. South Korea was briefly in the list of approved labs and then dropped out. And one of the practical problems is that many countries have strict regulations regarding the ability to transfer blood products across borders. So the idea was that if you were in some other country, you could send to the lab in one of these approved countries, get the results and use that. But as a practical matter, that wasn't possible. Individuals wound up hand carrying samples across borders, paying couriers. It was a big problem to get the blood test required for the lab. The titer test also had to be drawn. The blood test had to be drawn 90 days before entry. That didn't match up with a lot of people's travel schedules. Diplomats going through the summer reassignment to new locations, military coming back and forth. They don't have a 3-month window saying when that they can use to get all this processing in place. And then, of course, the processing itself was not particularly quick. 6 weeks is a long lead time for a lot of folks. Travelers, US citizens, residents with pets, fully subject to this. Short-term traveler could not come back with their dog. Foreign diplomats could not come back with their dogs. The result was there was a lot of very vocal pushback on all of this, particularly from the military communities, particularly from diplomats, saying that this really wasn't going to work, that announcing the system with just 28 days notice surprised travelers, it surprised importers, airlines, customs brokers, and the rest. And there was a lot of pushback on the CDC. Additionally, there were a couple other things that were interesting. The CDC announcement said you've got to get a permit, but they didn't have a permit process in place to administer. And in fact, what they were doing was adapting an older application for a permit to import a dog that was inadequately immunized for all these dogs that were properly immunized under the system. So testing, paperwork, all very difficult. Airlines, equally confused, were refusing to accept dogs for transport, even if they had the permit, because there was such confusion. And CDC was then asked to help straighten out the airlines in individual cases to get these things back in. As a result of this chaos, the CDC created a transition process. They announced a transition process in July 14th. They renewed it on October 12th. And the idea here was that we were going to open up and address some of these concerns. They expanded the approved entry list of airports to 18, but then it was going to revert back to just approved airports, 3 at the moment, at the end of the transition period. But on November 19th, they effectively got rid of the transition. So now imports with a permit can come in at any of the 18 airports that have quarantine facilities. The blood testing labs, the approved labs, was now expanded from the 4 or 5 to 66 in a variety of countries, 19 labs in 9 high-risk countries, and 3 in the United States. You still have the issue about moving blood products around if you don't have a lab in your particular country, but this network of approved labs roughly matches what the European Union does under its pet passport scheme, and has obviously greatly alleviated that problem. The titer testing, the blood testing waiting period, was reduced from 90 days to 45, and travelers and returning citizens and residents were made exempt from this whole scheme if they had a US vaccination and a US rabies vaccination certificate. Foreign government employees were also added back in. So there have been a number of changes. All of these changes have been announced on the CDC website without any publication under the Federal Register Act. So what do we have? I'm running a little late here, but I'll quickly go through this. What caused this? There was a surge in bad rabies vaccination certificates, longstanding concern that the CDC had. Additionally, there were some infected dogs, one each in several years, 3 years, that came into the United States, all from Egypt, and all subject to an earlier import suspension ban. So it was already addressed. The rabies vaccination issues all the rabies vaccination problems basically centered on falsified ages. Importers were bringing in puppies for puppy trafficking purposes and trying to get around the requirements of the various regulations by altering the ages on the paperwork. And this has been a historic problem that the CDC has been dealing with, and they saw a marked increase in these types of problems in 2020, in part presumably related to the greater adoption rate of dogs or the greater purchasing of dogs during the pandemic year. What's good about this whole system? It actually moves the US away from a dependence on rabies vaccination certificates alone prepared by foreign veterinarians and others officials that they don't know, to what is now the international gold standard, which is you have a vaccination followed by a titer test. And it's been recommended by the World Organization for Animal Health, endorsed by the WHO, and used for more than 2 decades by the EU, Australia, Guam, Korea, Japan, the UK, and in fact, the state of Hawaii. What's bad about this whole system is that it was really an overreaction to problem with the rabies vaccination certificates. There have been procedural issues about has the CDC properly complied with the Administrative Procedure Act and the Federal Register Act, and there's been a failure to extend this new import permit process to any importer, anyone who can show that they have met the requirements. Additionally, CDC has been overwhelmed by the number of applications. We have this multiplicity of agencies involved, and we've got Hawaii's successful system used since 1997 being partially preempted. So what's next? How long is this suspension going to last? It was tied to the COVID pandemic. If the COVID pandemic emergency goes away, this goes away. If the CDC director modifies this suspension, then we'll have different rules, or a year from last June. As other speakers will talk about, the CDC has committed to making changes to this system and will do so. What sorts of changes should we look at? Open the import process to anyone for bringing in dogs for any purpose who can comply with the vaccination and titer protocols without restricting the number of applications, the number of dogs, or the ports of entry. You also need to go to Congress to say about additional resources to support not only the CDC, but all the agencies working in this area. And we need to reconsider the idea of vaccination certificates for all dogs coming into the United States, even from rabies-free countries. Those can be done in the short term. In the long term, we ought to use the Federal Advisory Committee Act and engage stakeholders and other participants in this process, including airlines, brokers, importers, and rescues, to say, how can we keep the US rabies-free in an efficient fashion without creating these issues? Thank you, and I'm sorry for running a little over.
Thank you so much, Pete. That was really wonderful overview of the prior rules, current rules, problems, recommendations. That was a great backdrop for the rest of our talk. I want to remind folks, as you have questions, please drop them into the Q&A function and we will address them at the end. And I'm pleased to now introduce our second speaker. Dr. Catherine Pollock is the head of stray animal care in Southeast Asia for Four Paws International, a global animal welfare organization working to end the suffering of wild, stray, and farmed animals around the world. Catherine is double boarded, a veterinary specialist in shelter medicine and also veterinary preventive medicine. With Four Paws, Catherine manages companion animal welfare programs and campaigns in Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, India, and Vietnam, with a special focus on combating the dog and cat meat trades. She's authored numerous articles and publications on animal welfare and on infectious disease. And I want to say a special thank you to Catherine for being with us today from Bangkok, where I believe it is 11:30 p.m. and we are grateful to you for your late night. So thank you, Catherine.
Well, thank you for having me. Yeah, it is late, so I'm not sure I'm going to be at my peak performance, but we'll give this a go. It's just a real pleasure to be able to speak on this topic. As you mentioned, I live and work in Southeast Asia, and so I've been involved in quite a few transports of animals, largely from Asia to North America, but also to Europe. So this too is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. I'm going to be speaking now a bit different than Pete's presentation. I'm going to be speaking more from an animal welfare perspective, a veterinary perspective. And when I'm talking about international transport, I'm generally talking about the transport of dogs for rescue purposes rather than commercial sale, which would be a different talk altogether. And so again, backing up a bit, I just wanted to quickly mention, for those of you in the rescue community that are on this call, this is your bread and butter. I'm sure you're well versed in this, why international dog transport is even part of the conversation. Why is this something we're even doing? Flying dogs around the world, seems crazy, right? For individual animals, of course, the benefit is obvious. It is truly life-saving. Many of these animals are taken out of a very bad situation. They might live on the street, or they might not have an owner. They don't have a very good probability of a positive outcome wherever they are. And so we can use the example of a stray dog in Vietnam who might be at risk of being stolen for its meat, or a street dog in India, potentially subject to cruelty and neglect. But as it pertains, when we look at, of course, it's life-saving for this individual animal, but it also really provides live outcome opportunities for rescue groups, for NGOs that are working under some pretty incredible challenges. I'm going to speak on the next slide about that. And so overall, it increases organizational life-saving capacity. When you have this as an option, when you have people that, abroad that are interested in providing adoptive homes for these animals, and you obviously are faced with this incredible need to try to, rehome dogs and provide rescue services. It definitely supports animal welfare campaigns from a campaigning perspective, and I'm going to speak on that towards the end of this presentation. It also increases international awareness of animal welfare issues. If you think about dog transport, you might have heard of it, as it pertains to dogs from the Sochi Olympics or from the dog meat trade, right? So sometimes those go hand in hand, but it also provides really important partnership opportunities for not only the groups that are exporting dogs, but also for the groups that are importing dogs. And so that's just certainly worth mentioning. And there's a variety of other benefits as well. People returning home with their animals, the reunification of pets with family, etc. And so kind of following up on what I just mentioned about the situation in many parts of the developing world, that these international animal welfare charities face just incredible challenges. And perhaps these challenges have never been greater than during the COVID pandemic. Many of these charities work in environments where there's a very limited adoption culture, right? In areas where there's a high stray animal overpopulation, that's generally not the type of animal that most local people will adopt, right? We are seeing growing pet ownership particularly in Asia, and so that's really exciting, but it's not generally, of dogs that, certainly look like the one here on the slide. It's generally more for the purebred looking dogs. And so for animal welfare charities, this makes things very difficult, and they have very limited options for dogs that aren't small and white and cute and fit a certain appearance. And many of these charities also are operating in countries, in cities with, very limited, but often completely absent animal welfare legislation. So these animals are afforded little to no legal protection, cruelty, neglect. There's not a whole lot that can be done about it. And many of these, facilities, the shelters are just at capacity. And so again, when we're thinking about, international adoption, for some shelters, it does really provide, that very much needed, route to get some of these animals into loving homes. So when we're thinking about, okay, if you're a rescue group and let's say you're working in Southeast Asia and you're thinking, like, where do I want to send dogs to? Like, where should I, look to send them? Well, this is a bit old now, and so this is certainly out of date now since the CDC suspension. But if we look at, our options, like where are there adopters that would potentially help adopt these dogs? Often we're talking about the US, Canada, UK, not New Zealand, forget New Zealand, that's just in this table, but the EU potentially. But when we think about, well, if you're a rescue group, you have limited resources and you want to send the dogs to a place where there's, generally it's the easiest, right? It's just easier to get the dogs to that destination. And so when we look at, the US and Canada, what's very obvious why rescue group would choose the US and Canada, because very little to no really infectious disease testing, and no quarantine requirements. So great. So if I'm a rescue group, I can vaccinate the dog, keep it in my care for 30 days, and then it could be eligible for transport. But obviously that's not the case anymore in the US. And so many sheltering groups have shifted transport largely to Canada, but also to the EU as well. And so there's all these great things about, the life-saving capacity that international transport has, but this is certainly not without controversy. And, particularly in the veterinary community, but largely from an infectious disease perspective. I'm not going to go into detail, spend a lot of time talking about specific, cases of disease importation, but there are certainly well-documented instances of animals, that, were infected with a disease, and some of which actually spread locally. And certainly the disease that we worry about most from a public health perspective is rabies. But certainly there are other diseases that can transmit, to people or to other animals, canine influenza being a good example of that. And so the risk is real, certainly not trying to downplay, that there is an infectious disease risk associated. I think with the transport of any living and breathing, creature or being. But there's other, controversial aspects of this as well. And I think one of them is that, for dogs that may have a disease, certain diseases are common in the countries of export, and they very well may challenge veterinary practitioners in the importing countries. So like Leishmania would be a good example, where, we don't see Leishmania in the US. And so your average general practitioner is going to be, that's not going to be on the top of their differential list for a sick dog that comes to their clinic. And I think, one of the biggest concerns is that this is not a sustainable approach to local animal welfare issues. And I don't think that anybody is arguing that this is a sustainable approach. We're not certainly going to internationally adopt out, all the dogs in some of these communities where there's a stray dog overpopulation. But again, there are so many benefits, and it can actually have a much wider benefit from a campaigning perspective. Again, I'm going to speak specifically about the dog meat trade and how these transports are so integral to campaigning success and achieving political change, in countries, throughout Asia. And then, of course, as Pete mentioned, there is the potential for fraudulent paperwork, sometimes intentional, sometimes unintentional, but this certainly can happen as well. But the good news is, like, we can do this right. We can do this in a way that we can minimize the infectious disease risk, save animal lives, and protect public health at the same time. And millions of dogs have gone through this process. And one of the key practices deals with the selection of the animals, right? We want to choose animals that are the lowest probability for being ill, for harboring infectious disease. And so what does this mean? Well, this means this rules out the cute puppies. The cute puppies are the ones that potentially might be harboring infectious disease. We generally want to be transporting healthy adult dogs that have been vaccinated, dewormed, et cetera, that we can ensure, their physical and their behavioral health. But speaking of behavioral health, this is another consideration as well, because we often talk about the physical health of the animal, but many of these dogs, let's take the dog meat trade dog in Korea that may have spent its life in a cage, or a stray dog in Thailand, for instance, may or may not have ever been on a leash before, may or may not have ever lived inside before, probably not, has probably never gone up and down stairs before. So all of these are important considerations as well, in addition to ensuring the physical health, because we have to set these animals up for success from the start. And so that's where also sound partnerships and transparency between importing agencies and exporting organizations. I'm definitely more in favor of organizations, collaborating together to ensure that the protocols are sound, to make sure these animals are getting vaccinated, to make sure that there's infectious disease testing, rather than dogs going to individual adopters that may or may not have that expertise and capacity. So setting these animals up for success, really important from the get-go. And we do that through having sound preventive health protocols. And so, this is at a minimum, like this is bare minimum here. Vaccination, we want to make sure they're vaccinated for deadly canine diseases, distemper parvovirus. If we can booster these animals as well, great. And then we also want to ensure that they have the rabies vaccine on board, endo and ectoparasite control. That might vary in terms of what's locally available. Generally, the dogs get spay-neuter surgery. This could potentially happen in the importing location, just depends. And the animals need to be microchipped as well. And I have here, behavioral assessment. Yes, these dogs should be getting behavioral care, right? Socialization, again, preparing them for what a home life might look like in the US. And then disease screening, right? And so I have here ongoing, because this is not just like a tick the box, the dog looks healthy. Like this is ongoing, right? If a dog has subclinical illness, it may, exhibit signs of illness on some days, maybe not on others. And so making sure that that animal is healthy, throughout its shelter stay, and then testing for diseases that, we have, that the agency that's, exporting the dog has available to them. So that might be heartworm test kits, you might be testing for tick-borne disease. And one of the real challenges too is that sometimes there's not even access to a very skilled local veterinarian. Some of the communities where we run programs in Southeast Asia, the local veterinarian needs training. And so who's going to do that? Is it the organization that's exporting the dog? Is it the organization that's importing the dog? And so making sure that there is a sound partnership, or at least a local veterinarian, that is skilled and understands what is needed. So that's for the group sending the dog. But what about the group that's importing the dog? So there's no, I think, like hard and fast rule, but generally, quarantining animals when they arrive at the facility in the US for 2 weeks, that is generally enough time to allow for the expression of most canine infectious diseases. Again, though, ongoing screening, relationship with a supportive veterinarian, I think so important here. And one of the things that I've seen, doing this for many years is that, there are some veterinarians who are not supportive of this endeavor. Why didn't you go to your local animal shelter? Why are you bringing in a dog from China? And I think that, the issue with that is, everyone's entitled for their, with their own opinions. But the issue is that the dog is already here, right? Like at this point, the dog is already in your exam room. And so making sure that, that there's a veterinarian that's going to support the client and support the animal through the process. Dogs can also be, revaccinated, depending on the vaccine protocol, for, let's say, locally endemic disease like leptospirosis with what Pete mentioned earlier. I think it's also worth mentioning, though, that international transport does not happen in isolation. Like rescue groups are not, rescuing a dog, getting a crate, sending it abroad. Like this is far too complex and expensive, for groups to do that. And so generally, international transport is part of a larger, either campaign or program to improve animal welfare. Having the opportunity to send dogs internationally frees up vitally needed resources for community-based programs, for community education, for improving responsible pet ownership, for, rescuing more dogs. And so, I just wanted to mention that, again, there's never been a greater need for, providing community support. And without this opportunity for live release, for sending dogs, it eats into the resources that might have been available for those types of programs. I want to spend just a few minutes talking about the dog meat trade in Asia because it's such an important companion animal welfare issue, and it does go hand in hand often with international transport. And so that actually might be how you've heard of, dogs flying internationally. And so just very briefly, if you're not familiar with this topic, this trade involves millions and millions of dogs every year, many of which are stolen pets or stray dogs. And this is not only an animal welfare issue, it's a huge public health risk, largely because of rabies, right? How do we eliminate rabies in a community? We try to vaccinate as many dogs as we can, but the dog meat trade doesn't discriminate between dogs that are vaccinated or unvaccinated. So many times vaccinated dogs are slaughtered for their meat. And the trade also traffics potentially rabies infected dogs nationally across borders, putting many people that are involved in the trade at risk of rabies infection. And so how is international transport related to this? Well, for one, it really helps raise international awareness of the issue, increases public pressure. It can help facilitate, petition signatures. These dogs can be used at embassy engagements. But I think most importantly is that, governments, the crux of this issue is always, governments, I think, recognize that this is an issue, local governments, but they don't have a slush fund for rescuing thousands of dogs. Like they don't have, facilities for sheltering dogs. And so that's really where that vital NGO support comes in. But NGOs need to have capacity to be able to, adopt and transport out some of these dogs. Again, because many of these communities, there's a very limited adoption market for these dogs. And so I just wanted to very quickly, talk about our experience in Cambodia. We worked very closely with the Siem Reap government, Siem Reap, a very iconic city in Southeast Asia. And the government recognized this is a big issue. We don't want to be associated with this, from an international perspective. And they passed a pretty strong ban on this trade. And then come the next February, so that was in July, come February, the Department of Agriculture calls us up and says, okay, well, we intercepted this truck of 61 dogs, like come get them. And, at the time we didn't have a shelter, right? So this is the dogs as they're unloading them out of this truck. And so we were able to set up a temporary shelter and get some of these dogs internationally transported to actually to LA, to our partner, the Barking Lot in San Diego. And that was right before the suspension happened. And so that government action, though, wouldn't have been possible without that NGO support and without having, the capacity to, take care of these dogs and find them homes. And so the remaining dogs, 30 some of them, because of the suspension, are still, awaiting their forever homes. We do a local adoption campaign. So it's not that, we're just trying to send these dogs internationally. But again, limited market and really hard during COVID. Like people are really struggling. And so they're not exactly in the market, most people. And expats have left, Southeast Asia, there are very few expats that are still here because of the travel bans and whatnot. Pete already mentioned this, but again, there has to be this balance, right? Striking a balance between public health protection and animal welfare and life-saving efforts. And so how do most countries do this? Yeah, rabies titer testing. Like the majority of countries like the EU, UK, Australia, Singapore, Japan, just to name a few, they require a rabies test. And so what is that? That is where the dog is vaccinated for rabies. You wait at least 30 days, take a blood sample, send it to an approved laboratory, and the dog generally can travel within, at least 90 days after the date of the blood draw. So, that's certainly a way of determining that, yes, that vaccine was effective. Yes, the dog has protective immunity. And yes, that dog is safe to be imported. The downside of that is, yes, it's an extra cost and it's a 4-month period, right? So the shelter or the group has to have the capacity to provide care for that dog. But this is certainly, what the rest of the world does, and the rest of the community is already familiar with doing this, right? Because they're already probably have sent dogs to the EU, so this isn't going to be some, radical change for them. I can be reached at Pollock K, P-O-L-A-K-K at ufl.edu if anyone has any questions, and that's all I have.
Catherine, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. We are getting great questions in the Q&A. Please keep them going. We're going to make sure we have time for them. If you do submit your question as anonymous and we don't get to it today, we're not going to be able to contact you. If you would like us to follow up with an answer, please submit with your name. No pressure. I'm really happy to introduce our third panelist today. Jillian Lyons is the Director of Regulatory Affairs at the Humane Society Legislative Fund, where she works with federal agencies, including the United States Department of Agriculture and the Department of Health and Human Services, to champion the implementation and enforcement of federal regulations that support the protection of animals. Jillian holds a JD from Pace University, where she focused on the intersection of environmental and animal law in her studies. Jillian, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. And thank you, Peter and Catherine, for your great presentation. So my role here is, now that Peter has given you the background on what the temporary suspension does, and Dr. Pollock has discussed its impacts on the veterinary and international rescue communities, I really wanted to walk you through the United States regulatory process, because we are very hopeful that people will take this opportunity to weigh in with the federal government and sort of talk about what we need to see in a more permanent importation structure, as Pete discussed in his presentation. And I want to preface that by saying, I'm certainly not here to tell you what you should say to the federal government. Different stakeholders are going to have different perspectives on the suspension and what a permanent structure should look like, but we're very hopeful that people will weigh in and use every available opportunity to do so. So I'll sort of start from the beginning and go through some of the points that Peter raised. If I can get this to, there we go. Okay, so in June of this year, when the CDC announced this temporary suspension, as Peter noted, there was no opportunity for public comment. They essentially said that this notice was not a rulemaking under the APA. It was an emergency action taken under agency authority. And because of that, there was no notice for public comment. They did, however, state in that notice that they really viewed the temporary suspension as a time period where they could work with stakeholders, federal stakeholders, state stakeholders, airlines, rescue communities, all of those different stakeholders, to really talk about what they were going to put into a more permanent structure at the end of the day. So what the end of the day looks like, as Peter mentioned, is a little unclear. The June notice did state that the suspension was in place until the end of the COVID-19 public health emergency declaration, or 360 days from its official publication in the Federal Register, which was June of this year. Essentially, what this means is that within the next 6 months, we should either see an extension of the temporary suspension, or we should see the agency really beginning to work through the rulemaking process. And as Peter mentioned, CDC officials have been very clear that they are going to issue a notice of proposed rulemaking, which will solicit solution-based comments from stakeholders. So because of this, I'm sort of going to walk you through what that process looks like, so you know where you have your opportunities for weighing in. So I think the first thing for everybody to know is that twice a year, the federal government publishes something that's called the Unified Agenda. It comes out in the spring and the fall, and it outlines every regulation that the government is going to publish within the next 6 months. A few regulations don't make it into the Unified Agenda, but I think we can expect to see CDC's proposal here. And why that's important for you to know is because when the Unified Agenda is published, it will give you a timeline for when the agency expects to take these actions. So there will be a notation that says, this is when CDC expects to issue their proposed rule. And then there will be a subsequent notation that says, and this is when we're planning to issue the final rule. So that'll give you a little bit of a timeline as you're working through how you want to weigh in on when you should expect certain actions to come out. So once that timeline is established, and what we know the CDC is sort of doing right now is developing that proposed rule. So once that is developed, if the rule is deemed significant, it will go to the White House Office of Management and Budget. And we don't know yet if this rule is going to be deemed significant enough to go to OMB, but this is an important thing for stakeholders to know, because if it does go to OMB, this may be the first real opportunity for stakeholders to meet with White House and CDC officials to talk about the rule and what they would like to see in the rule. So Executive Order 12866 essentially gives the White House the responsibility to coordinate interagency review of significant regulations. The reason we don't know if CDC's regulation will go to OMB review is because we don't know if it will be categorized as significant, but there are a couple of triggers that may be at play here. The first is that OMB reviews rules that have an impact over $100 million per year on the economy or adversely affect any sector of the economy. In CDC's June notice, they said that they thought the estimate of the suspension was about $11.8 million a year, but they moved a range up to about $57.6 million. So they thought it could have an annual effect on the economy of $57 million a year, but we don't know what will be in the permanent CDC proposal. And that could raise the cost estimates over $100 million and trigger OMB review. There is also another trigger, which essentially says that if the CDC's action is going to contradict an action taken by another agency or sort of complicate the regulatory playing field, OMB may review that regulation just to ensure that all of the sort of interacting agency regulations make sense. And that may be a trigger here because, as Peter mentioned, there is a really seemingly contradictory playing field of dog importation regulations at play here. So OMB may decide to review this regulation based on that trigger. And I will reiterate again, this is a really important place for stakeholders to consider weighing in. The OMB website, and I'll provide a link at the end of my presentation, has a place where stakeholders can request meetings with the OMB. And essentially in those meetings, you are in the room with White House officials and CDC officials, and you have the opportunity to talk about what the suspension, those impacts on yourself, and what you would like to see in the CDC's proposal. I'll make a note here that when the rule goes to OMB at this exact stage, the text of the rule is not available to the public. So you're sort of meeting with the White House and CDC officials a little bit blind. But you should definitely come prepared to talk about the impacts of the rules on yourself, and particularly focus on the economic impacts, because OMB is really interested on the economics of rules and how it's going to play out for rescues or individuals. Just really talk about what that impact is on yourself. So after OMB reviews the rule, they will either make a recommendation to the agency to withdraw that rule or to move forward. And the agency will publish the rule in the Federal Register for public comment. So this is really the most important point for stakeholder engagement. And you basically have between 30 and 60 days, but sometimes up to 180 days to comment on the public comment period that the agency has put out. So you will be able to read through CDC's proposal and have a certain amount of time to respond to it. During this time period, the agency may also open it up for public hearings where you can present your comments to the CDC officials, and they may also take meetings with stakeholders and organizations. So really, this is probably the most vital time period for stakeholders to get engaged, but I will recommend that when you do engage in this process, to really tailor everything to the scope of what is in the CDC's proposed rulemaking. A lot of times people comment and the agency sort of deems it outside the scope of the rulemaking, and they ignore those comments. So when you are responding, really make sure that you are focused on responding exactly to what you want to see in that proposal, so the agency pays attention and hopefully incorporates your thoughts into the final rule. So after they do this, they basically review all of the comments that come in and decide whether or not any of the comments that were submitted rise to the level of necessitating changes in the final rule. If they do that, they will add those changes into the final rule, sort of finalize it and send it one more time up to OMB for review. After that, OMB will either give the go-ahead to publish it or say, you know, the White House needs a couple more changes, and they will send it back to the agency and it will enter into the Federal Register as a final rule. So really, there are a couple of places throughout here in this slide I can definitely send to anybody who's interested for you to really participate in the process. But I will also say that once a final rule is on the books, that doesn't mean advocacy work is over. So if we get through this process and you're not necessarily pleased with what the CDC has put on the books, always make sure that as advocates, you're paying attention post-final rule. The implementation and enforcement phase are really incredibly important parts of rulemaking. And we have to pay attention as advocates to say, like, make sure enforcement isn't skewed against one sector of the regulated community. Like, for instance, if we were seeing the CDC do enforcement actions against rescues and not necessarily dog dealers, we want to keep our eyes on what's happening post-final rule to make sure that enforcement isn't skewed. We also want to make sure, if we don't like the rule, that we have, you know, the opportunities in future administrations to go back and recommend to the next administration that this rule not be in place permanently. Final rule doesn't necessarily mean final forever. And as advocates, we have the opportunity to not only use the rulemaking process, but to use the post-rulemaking process to really influence agency action. And the one other thing that I will say as advocates that we should really be focused on is using your senators and representatives as resources. While a lot of the process here is, of course, reaching out and engaging with the CDC and HHS, Congress is really interested in this. You saw on Peter's slide earlier in the presentation, a lot of offices have already weighed in and expressed concern with this action. But representatives and senators want to know that their constituents personally are impacted by an agency action in order to take action. And they have the avenue of doing authorizing legislation, which can modify the CDC's program if they wanted to, or they can use the yearly appropriations process to sort of guide the CDC's program through funding in directions that they would like to see. But in order to do that, they really need to know that their constituents are impacted. So when you're working through this process, and if you decide to work through this process, don't ignore Congress. Weigh in every available opportunity with the CDC and to the White House, but also weigh in with Congress. And then on this slide is basically every resource that I discussed and all of the available places where you can be engaged as a stakeholder. And that's it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Jillian. That was so educational and a lot of real practical information for future engagement, which is really useful. I believe we will try to share the slides with attendees. If we're not able to do that, again, you can email me, dbray@stanfordalumni.org, and we will share the slides. We've got a great set of questions. We have 12 minutes, so speakers, please be as brief as you can in your answers. We've had a couple of questions about whether a recording of this presentation will be available. It will be available. If we can email it to attendees, we'll do that. If not, you can follow the American Bar Association International Animal Law Committee on Facebook or LinkedIn, and we'll post the recording. Or you can follow me personally on Facebook and LinkedIn, or email me and we'll share the recording. First question, someone says that Customs and Border Protection at some airports, Chicago and New York in particular, have required that anyone bringing dogs into the country employ the use of a broker and have a brokerage clearance to enter. Was that a CDC requirement, or was that set only by stations at those airports? Were those requirements ever published? Anyone have familiarity with that?
To the best of my knowledge, there is no CDC or APHIS publication that says that you have to use a customs broker. However, use of a customs broker really facilitates the process. One of the concerns that the government has had is surprise. They claimed that people at airports, government officials at airports, CBP and the rest, don't know when the dogs are arriving, and suddenly they've got a pallet load of animals to deal with as cargo, or a plane load of dogs that have come in as checked baggage, and they say, my gosh, we don't know what's here. Maybe it's typically they arrive late at night and on weekends when people aren't around, and suddenly they've got to go check rabies vaccination certificates and the rest of this. So surprise has been a problem historically in the past, particularly since the CDC regulations did not require, up until the suspension, prior approvals or import permits. So the use of a broker, while it adds some cost, and their pre-clearance process does mean that you can get the information that Flight X has these dogs coming in from this destination. We've got this paperwork, it's all set to go and ready to go, and that can be very helpful. The other thing that's been happening, particularly with this suspension, is that it is becoming more and more and more common for airlines at the departure point to say, let me see your paperwork. And if you don't have the paperwork, we're not going to board the animals. And if you've got the paperwork and you can put it into the system, it gets in the airline system, gets into the governmental system, it's a real advantage for clearing the process once you arrive at the other end.
Thank you. Catherine, I see that you answered this question in writing, but I think it's a key question. So I'd like to ask you, and if you could quickly respond to it. Do you think it is responsible to continue importing dogs knowing the overpopulation crisis the US shelters are in?
Yeah, great question. One that I think I failed to bring up during my presentation, but yeah, I mean, it's certainly a concern, right? To say, well, look, like animals are being euthanized. Why are we importing more? Like, fair enough. And so my personal response, obviously I'm a bit biased, right? Because these, transports, they really feed into the campaigning work that I do. And it really has contributed to political, success and legislative change for potentially millions of dogs. So for me, hugely beneficial. I mean, I'm also a personal believer that a life saved is a life saved. If it's a dog from China, it's a dog from the US. But what I will say is an interesting, component to this also is that, as again, talking about the dog meat trade, these dogs really can be leveraged in local media. And so what we've seen is dogs that have arrived, be it from China or Korea, whatnot, and they generate a lot of media attention, a lot of foot traffic of people that want to see, what this is about, and shelters that have all but cleared, almost cleared their entire shelter with adopters that came in. They had heard about the dog meat trade dogs, but they fell in love with this other dog. So I think they can really be leveraged to, save so many more animals than just that individual animal. But I certainly recognize that this is controversial and is maybe more appropriate for some places, than others.
Thank you, Catherine. We have a question. This is about the rabies titer testing requirements. The questioner says, if they remember correctly, the CDC announcement said that rabies titer testing costs something like $50. The questioner's experience is that it can cost between $250 and $400. Will that incorrect cost estimate to the public be corrected? And also, will the realities of the known insufficiencies of the titer testing be evaluated? So I think the first question is, what about the cost of titer testing? I think our panelists have something to say about what rescues could expect this to cost, perhaps. I see your face, Catherine, maybe not. And then would you like to say anything about the reliability of the titer testing?
Well, I can kick this off. Yeah, I mean, so testing varies. It's going to vary depending on the laboratory and the country that you're in. This is also why rescues don't really like this, because it does add an additional expense. So, I mean, we just did some titer testing of our Cambodian dogs, actually the three lovely pups that you saw on the slide. And I want to say that cost us about $180 a dog, and we sent that to a lab, I believe, in the UK. But in Thailand, certainly it can cost $300 a dog. So it's certainly not cheap, particularly if you're doing quite a few dogs. What I'll say, about the titer testing and the insufficiencies, I mean, there's very few tests, particularly antibody tests, that are ever going to be like 100%, right? And you're also going to have non-responders. And so I think that this test, however, is the best option that we have, right? Like, rabies is not also a disease that we can test for. That's why we euthanize dogs that are suspect cases and we send their heads in, to test their brains. So we don't have a really good antemortem diagnostic. And so this is, I think, that the best test that we have available to us now.
Thank you, Catherine. We move on to a question
I
for
could just-
Jillian.
If I
Okay,
could just
yes.
quickly add on that, as we all know, no vaccination is 100% effective. And we've seen that with COVID. And I think some of the studies we've seen on rabies are that even a properly administered great vaccine has something like a 4.9% failure rate. So ongoing surveillance is a part of a disease control system. And the CDC actually has done a good job in that they picked up these infected dogs that came in that did show a problem. They don't always know in each case whether the fact that the dog is infected is a failure of the vaccine that was improperly administered, improperly stored, or just fraud. So to use an old phrase, trust but verify, the idea of having a vaccination certificate that says, yeah, we did something, and then a follow-up test that says, and this is the result of what we did, actually is a good system.
I
Thank you,
did
Pete.
also just want to say, going back to my discussion, it sounds like maybe that the person who asked that question has some concerns about the cost. And I think putting those concerns into a comment that you submit to the agency is a really valuable tool. If you have noticed areas where you think that their information is incorrect, send that to them. Don't always expect that they will get it from somebody else. Really use this opportunity to present that misinformation, if there is some, to the agency and have them consider it when they're developing the final rules.
Thank you. And Jillian, we have a question. Can you give an estimate on how long the rulemaking process takes? Many of us in rescue are assuming this ban will go on for at least another year or more, waiting for the new rules to come out. What do you think on timing?
It's hard. I mean, honestly, everybody's heard the jokes about federal government red tape. And I think that, as we all know, HHS is pretty under siege with COVID-19. I have seen rulemakings that are expedited that can be from the proposed rule stage to the final stage in 6 months. And there are others that take years. I really wish that I could give a better answer. But I think one of the things, again, is using that comment period to tell the agency in your discussions with the CDC and the White House to let them know that we need something that's permanent. We can't sort of be kept, either get rid of the suspension, do something that makes it all clear to the regulated community, and do it fast. And I think that's a really important thing that we all need to be weighing in with the agency to do. But I'm sorry, I don't have a better timeline. The federal government is hard on that.
And another question, clearly from an attendee also who has been impacted by the ban. They say, as a golden retriever rescue volunteer, how can we help our rescue partners in Turkey? They've always vaccinated, screened for diseases, provided temperament assessments. They've done a great job, and they're now prevented from bringing these dogs in. Any suggestions on how we can help our partner in Turkey?
Just toss out that that's a tough and difficult situation, and you could substitute Turkey, China, any country that's on the list, Russia, whatever. They're all impacted by this. The high risk rabies country list is updated annually, and they use a variety of statistics and information on that. So encouraging countries to publish that information and gathering it and submitting it is probably the best thing you can do, but it's kind of awkward. There's not really a magic bullet that says, we can get Turkey out or we can get China out or whatever, without addressing the issue of, is the disease still endemic in that particular jurisdiction? That's why it's so important, I think, to take the approach that Jillian has said, that says, all right, we're dealing with an endemic country, but we've got a good, internationally recognized, proven control system, which is vaccination followed by titer testing from approved labs. And opening that system to any importer for any purpose is the way forward.
I'll just also add very quickly, when we're talking about working with partner charities, maybe there are other ways, to help this group during the pause, right, during the suspension. Maybe there are ways to do veterinary training, find veterinary training opportunities, maybe webinars, maybe I don't know, fundraisers to help fund, I don't know, a community education project or something else. So, I mean, we're certainly trying to be creative during this ban while, you know, we're just unable to send the dogs right now.
Thank you so much. I want to say again that for folks whose questions, if we didn't get to your question and we have your name, we'll try and follow up. If anyone would like to reach out to me, dbray@stanfordalumni.org, I will do my best to connect you with resources. I'm going to take a moderator's privilege in our last minute together and read to you from a note that was sent. I mentioned that the International Animal Law Committee helped rescue 4 dogs from the meat trade in China. And a rescuer of 2 of the dogs sent a note with the dogs when they came to the US. And I just want to read a little bit from that note. Dashu and Zhaoshu are sisters. So far in China, because there is no animal protection law, so many dog dealers keep catching dogs and selling them to restaurants. Dashu and Zhaoshu's parents have been taken away, but fortunately they escaped successfully by hiding in a hole. They are the 2nd generation of vagrants, and because they are not purebred dogs, nor have excellent appearance, none of them have been adopted. Today, happiness finally opens the door for them. It is the American family that welcomes them. Thank you so much for your love and for giving them a home. Dashu and Zhaoshu have never been separated from each other since they were born. I hope they can often meet in the future and remember each other, love each other. The most important is, I hope you can love them sincerely until the day their lives leave. Thank you for your kindness and thank you for giving them a home. Please tell them that I love them forever. And Dashu and Zhaoshu are living together very happily in upstate New York, having a great life. And I wanted to leave you with the words from that rescuer as we all continue our work in this important area. So thank you, everyone. Have a great week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.